hands around the pot, James, and don't spare the horses.
Toot-toot! All aboard!
It's showtime.
All right, welcome in. It is another edition of On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics Podcast. I'm Dave Trafford, and in this edition, we are going to revisit some of the conversation that kind of got glossed over at the end of the legislative session a couple of weeks ago. Before the House rose for the summer, the opposition were asking the Financial Accountability Office at Queen's Park to make the government tell us exactly what the costs were involved with a 413 highway. And that would include any of the property that has been bought up, the value of the property, what kind of situation we would find ourselves in terms of preparations, whatever the numbers might be. And this has been going on for years. So it's important that we not let this kind of thing fade as we head into the summer months, because now that MPPs are back in their constituencies, the folks on the ground should be asking those questions, because the Information and Privacy Commissioner has said that the government has to hand over some of the requested documents. The government has refused, instead deciding to spend money on court challenges. Yes, dragging it through the courts. The 413 will be a significant infrastructure investment. Shouldn't we know what we're spending here? It's a legitimate question. And for whatever reason, the Ford government has decided that, well, they don't want to tell you. So, I had the chance to sit down with Paul Webster. He is an independent freelance reporter, and he has been on the front lines of this, not only reporting on it, but putting up his own cash to go to court to fight for our right to find out exactly what are the costs for Highway 413.
Toot toot! All aboard!
I have recently come across the phrase a couple of times, just randomly, but the phrase is learned helplessness. And it turns out that learned helplessness is a behavior exhibited by a subject after enduring repeated aversive stimuli beyond their control. It means you feel like you can't change the situation. And I kind of have that feeling that the press gallery is having at Queen's Park these days. Because no matter what we seem to do in terms of pressing the government comes back with some excuse, obfuscation, or heavy-handed legislation. And we've seen that lately because the province has successfully, I will say, gutted the freedom of information legislation in this province. And there's a lot at stake. And we've talked a lot about it on our podcast, On the Ledge. And of course, the folks at Trillium have been front and center. Jessica Smith-Cross is the editor-in-chief there. I know the folks at Global have been working hard on that with the FOIs, Toronto Star. And Paul Webster was in my inbox recently and reminded me that it's not just about telephones, and it's not just about what's going on in the Skills Development Fund. It's also about the whole question around the 413 and the Greenbelt. Paul Webster's been reporting extensively on things like the 413, the FOI issues. Joins us now, and Paul, do you ever get the sense that we're suffering from this learned helplessness, particularly when it comes to dealing with, accountability questions at Queen's Park?
Yeah, I get your point, but no, I don't personally feel helpless, and I suspect, most of the other reporters covering the Ontario government or even national affairs don't feel helpless. We got a pretty robust media ecosystem in Canada, and we still have a pretty good framework of freedom of information legislation. Even in Ontario, the changes that the Ford government drove through are significant, but they don't gut the act. They simply put the cabinet members personal communications off limits. And that's unfortunate because I think people really have relied on those communications for a lot of the reporting. And indeed, I think the Ethics Commissioner and the Auditor General of Ontario relied on those cabinet members' personal communications to come up with their absolutely damning audits of the Greenbelt scandal. So it matters what's happened with the changes to the FOI Act. But in my case, that nothing has changed. I have been pursuing information using the Freedom of Information legislation with regards to the Highway 413 for 5 years now, and reasonably successfully, to the point where I was able to report, a fair amount of highly pertinent information relating to issues surrounding the proposed highway. And then when I began to pursue information about the costs of the proposed highway, particularly the cost of land deals, I hit a barrier where the government just did not want to disclose information that it had. And I appealed that material to the Information Commissioner of Ontario. The Information Commissioner of Ontario backed me on that. And then the government sued the Information Commissioner and kind of by extension me. And we had to go to court over it. So the law, the Freedom of Information legislation is working. It's very slow. The government's fighting very hard to slow it down and not disclose information relating to land deals for the Highway 413. That's my direct experience.
Yeah, and again, we should draw the distinction because, and Jessica's made this point when I've talked to her about how the Trillium is using FOIs extensively, that it doesn't apply to every request. But as you point out, it's far more limited now vis-a-vis the activities of cabinet, their staff, what happens in the cabinet room, and so on. So how much is there a percentage or is there sort of a balance there in terms of your ability to get at the accountability questions? Is this at all hindered by the changes in the FOI for you?
No, not yet. I never sought using FOI. Sought personal records or otherwise for cabinet ministers. What I've sought is budget figures for the proposed Highway 413. Let's remember, this is a 61-kilometer superhighway that is proposed to run through largely farmlands, through the last remaining green spaces north of Toronto in the GTA. These lands are south of the Greenbelt. They're not protected. But they're farmland, and the government wants to build a superhighway through there. People see this superhighway really as a conduit for sprawl and for development. What's likely to happen if the highway goes through is that within the next 10, 15 years, we're going to see another city the size of Vaughan or Mississauga even emerge along the spine of that highway. So this is a monster development plan for the government of Ontario. It is an absolute bonanza for property developers who have staked out claims and bought these lands along the highway. So I came to the government and said, okay, so how much is this going to cost? You're going to buy all these lands now from these developers who've been in place for almost 20 years since the highway was first discussed by the government of Ontario. This is going to be expensive. Like, how expensive? And what are your records on it? And they said, yeah, we have records, but they're protected by cabinet confidentiality. And I said, why would that be? Why would the cabinet have been reviewing the intricate property records along the proposed path of the Highway 413? And they said, well, suck it up. They are protected by cabinet. I said, well, I'm not going to suck it up. Actually, I'm going to seek legal review by the Information Commissioner of Ontario under the, dictates of the law, under the availabilities of the law, which affords citizens the right to appeal secrecy with a simple $25 check to the Information Commissioner of Ontario. They undertake a legal review of the situation. They did that. We went back and forth for almost 3 years with the government of Ontario. Finally, the Information Commissioner said, no, these records are not cabinet confidential. these are records that should be released to the public, detailing the land costs of the proposed Highway 413. And the government said, we're going to take that to court. We want judicial review. In the lead up to the court hearing, which was on April 9, the government disclosed that just in preparing for the legal hearing, they had spent more than $100,000 on legal fees, simply to go to court one day for half a day. What the actual cost in total of the government's efforts to keep these land records secret, what the true cost is, I would imagine, and I'm just guessing, probably runs $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 just for my request. That's how intense the government is on keeping this material secret, under the what seems to be highly dubious claim that they are protected by cabinet confidentiality. The Information Commissioner of Ontario vehemently disagreed in court. The judges who heard the government's claims were pretty skeptical. My own lawyer, who stood up and countered the government of Ontario's case, simply said that the government was attempting to delay, obfuscate, and use every legal mechanism available to hinder public release of this information about these lands. It's analogous to the Greenbelt scandal somewhat, in that we're talking about government land acquisition contracts with developers who are perfectly positioned to make billions, tens of billions of dollars on the development of these lands north of Toronto. So the law
let
is
me
still
just stop you
working.
there just for a second. Let me just stop you, because I want to kind of come back to the implications down the road. But you just said that your own lawyer. So at this point, you're kind of flying solo on this. It's not, you're a freelancer.
That's true. That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
So you have pursued this on your own dime and on your own volition.
I have, yes. I began pursuing this information through Freedom of Information requests more than 5 years ago. And yes, I've done a lot of digging on this. And I can tend to continue digging on this. I think the government of Ontario should answer these questions. This is one of the biggest proposed mega projects in Canadian history. This highway is going to create a new city. It's a project of epic proportions. The government's never issued a single budget figure for it. They're simply just absolutely deflecting every question relating to what the cost of this will be. And they are working very, very hard, especially to keep the land contracts and the land acquisition figures secret. That's really the point of the whole effort on my part, is to simply lift a lid on that secrecy.
I was going to say, you're going to have to do a lot of freelance work to pay for lawyers to cover this.
Well, lawyers actually can be surprisingly kind when they see citizens doing the heavy lifting. The government, believe me, I haven't spent anything like what the government spent on this. Nothing like it. The government has top flight people who are all on the sunshine list. There were 4 of them, by my count, in court on April 9, government lawyers making the government's case here. You know, this is sort of a David and Goliath story, and I'm the David.
Yeah.
Just in case you're wondering.
No question. That was evident from the start. You and your slingshot.
Yes.
So take me to the next step here, because the court has heard this. This was about just almost a month ago now.
Yeah.
So where does it sit?
Well, there were 3 judges on the panel. It was at Osgoode Hall. Went for about 4 hours on April 9th. There was a lot of back and forth. I think the judges were listening very carefully. They asked a lot of hard questions. They demonstrated considerable skepticism about the government's position, but they could easily back the government's position. One just doesn't know. They reserved judgment. We're waiting for a decision. The decision will come down to whether or not the panel, the judicial panel that heard the arguments on April 9th, will allow the government to go forward with a judicial review of the secrecy and of the Information Commissioner of Ontario's order to the government to release the information to me and by virtue of that to the public. So the government has basically sued, demanding a judicial review. The panel heard their arguments. They will decide. That's where it stands now.
To be clear, the Information Commission was part of this action too, right?
Yeah, actually, the action was really the case was really between the Attorney General of Ontario and the Information Commissioner of Ontario. The Information Commissioner of Ontario a year and a half ago ordered the government to release the information about about the Highway 413 lands acquisition costs. The government said, no, we're not going to do it. We're not releasing this information. We're going to take you to court. I decided that it would probably be in the best interest of journalism in general to have representation and to be a party to the case. That was a kind of elective decision on my part. I wanted to be assertive. I wanted to be present. I wanted the judicial panel to see, yeah, this is a real person here. We're not talking about some kind of, virtual AI chatbot journalist. This is a real guy over there. And he's pretty keen on seeing this information. And he thinks the Information Commissioner of Ontario has got a very strong case to have this information released. And the fundamental question in law, I suppose, is to what degree can the government shield information by using the cabinet confidentiality claims within the Ontario Freedom of Information law? Cabinet confidentiality across all parliamentary democracies in the UK, wherever you go, Australia, cabinet confidentiality is considered sacred. It's respected. And I don't in any way quibble with that. I do think the cabinet has a right to discuss what it needs to talk about politically, financially, in setting the government strategy in confidence, in privacy. But whether or not they can kind of loop in huge bodies of records. What came out in court on April 9th is that we're talking about 4,000 pages of MPAC records. That is the, property tax records of Ontario that are in this information release that I'm trying to get. So, the government is saying, no, all these MPAC tax records, land property records are cabinet confidential. The Information Commissioner is saying, no, they're not. These are administrative records. They never went before cabinet. And you can't shield them all on the basis that the matter was discussed in cabinet. So to some degree, I suppose there is a principle in play here as to what degree the government can shield the release of information to the public claiming cabinet confidentiality. In this case, it seems the government may have dramatically overreached. And that's what I'm contesting. I'm not trying to, sort of win a point of constitutional law here. I'm just trying to see these land records for the proposed Highway 413.
And I think it begs the question whether or not it's Greenbelt, whether it's a skills development fund, whether it's phone records, and in this case, the highway budget, and we haven't talked about the tunnel yet. But the question is, if you're working so hard to hide this, what exactly are you hiding? And that sounds like, slimy gotcha stuff that the media is accused of all the time. But to me, it's a rake that this government puts out in front of itself consistently, and could easily be more transparent around some of this stuff, as you point out, that is obviously administrative or more likely not even associated with cabinet decisions. So it really puts, it's in a place where the public starts to pay attention more to this. We've seen where the FOI issue is coming up in polling, and people are starting to respond to it. And they may not understand the full detail of it down in the weeds as you do. But there's an accountability and a transparency question that's starting to really weigh on this government.
I think that would maybe the case. Dave, you'd be in a better position than me to make that assessment because you talk to so many people, so many more people than I do. I'm a little bit narrow in my focus in that I'm interested in environmental issues in Ontario, and I'm interested particularly in the Highway 413. I do think that the government has been, this particular government, since it restarted the Highway 413 project back in, I guess it was around 2019, has been extremely secretive. I've really ran into a wall of secrecy. I reported on it. I did about 10 pieces for both for the Toronto Star and the Trillium, and for a paper out in Caledon called In the Hills. Obviously, I'm still working on. I hope to continue reporting. The government's media management has been combative, secretive. They've also done things behind the scenes, like pretty much gutted the Environmental Assessment Act of Ontario, largely in order to circumvent a really thoroughgoing environmental assessment in Ontario. They also sued the federal government to get it to back off from a federal environmental assessment. So yes, the government's been extremely aggressive in its approach to getting this project built. No doubt if the premier were in on the call, he'd say, listen, it's really hard to get stuff built. You got to be proactive. You got to push hard. There's all this NIMBYism. There's all these laws that get in the way of development. We have an economy to build. We need highways. Yes, okay. That's his view of how to build the future of Ontario. I may not share that view. I respect, though, that they're elected to build things. They ran on that. That was their platform, very openly. So they've been transparent about that. I think the means that they're using are very heavy-handed, very secretive. I think the public should have a right to know about these land transactions for this proposed highway. It's 2,100 hectares of land purchases. That is enormous. The government of Ontario rarely buys that land on that scale. No Canadian government. It's unheard of in a major urban, the most densely populated area of Canada and one of the most densely populated areas of North America, to have a government step in and say, yeah, we're buying 2,100 hectares of land.
Well, and
to your
point,
how much is that going to cost?
Well, exactly, and that is at the heart of this question. It's not even let's debate about the environmental issues
and who owns the land and who bought it, who were the speculators who got in, who had conversations with the government before they got elected with Mr. Ford long before he became premier and said, we're buying up all this land and we'd really love it if you'd build a highway through it. We don't know that. We probably never will. But we do, I think, as the public, have a right to know how much is that going to cost. When the government steps in, federal government steps in and says, yeah, we're buying new submarines. We're buying new F-35s. We're going to build a hospital here. We're going to, when the Ontario government says we're doing a hospital project, the budget figures are floated through Infrastructure Ontario. They're generally pretty public. We know roughly what the new nukes are going to cost at Darlington. There's, these small nuclear reactors that they're building out. They budgeted that. I was looking at the website yesterday. There's lots of public budgeting in Ontario by the Ontario government. Why not for this particular highway? Is there something going on? I think that's a legitimate question.
Well, and there's a vacuum here, and we fill it immediately, and that's the challenge, and I think the difficulty, and why I kind of went to learned helplessness, is because this idea that no matter at what angle or what logical reason you can come up with, there doesn't seem to be any level of, again, the transparency, accountability on these select files specifically.
I don't think there's any mystery about it, Dave. I think it's probably pretty clear. There's been good reporting, not by many people other than me, and including some of my reporting, but many others, on the Highway 413 land deals and who's bought up the land along the proposed corridor for the highway. It's well known that the major development corporations have bought up vast stakes of land out all the way through Caledon, all the way through wherever it's lands available in Vaughan, along the corridor of the highway, right out to the proposed intersection with the Highway 400 northbound in King City. All that land got bought up. We can see buildings going up on that land. We can see the massive new warehouses being built by Walmart, Costco, many other major corporations on land that they lease or have bought. The land deals have been going, fast and furious ever since the government of Ontario restarted this proposed highway. This is all well known. I think the government's deciding to keep the budget figures secret because they're embarrassing. This amount of money that this expropriation is going to cost, which is basically writing checks for developers, is going to be vast. It's going to be billions and billions of dollars, likely.
So many of the stories that are really kind of fundamental in terms of accountability, they're labeled as process stories. And I'm a recovering news director, and I used to fight this all the time, where I would get, some producer or an editor saying, that's a thumbsucker, nobody cares. And to me, Paul, these are the kinds of stories that we really should be engaged in and activate some level of engagement.
I think the public does care. They really seem to care about the Greenbelt scandal. When the ethics commissioner's report came down and then the Auditor General's report came down, the RCMP launched an investigation. The public was like, yeah, we care. And the Premier said, yeah, the public cares and I'm backing off. I'm not going to do it. We're backing away from our $8 billion land kind of deals with the developers. The Premier himself personally recognized that the public did care. I think the public would care about this one too if they were to learn a bit more about these land deals. So I think that's why the government is fighting it so hard. It's not a process story. It's a land deal story. And the public does care because they do see, okay, so what's the relationship between the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party and its major funders, many of whom are developers? What's the relationship between the Premier and his many developer friends? We know we've heard speeches from the Premier in the Greenbelt scandal where he made promises to the developers about how he's going to open up the protected lands. We know that this Premier is very, very pro-development. He wants to redevelop Toronto Harbour to turn it into a pathway for jets, including his own jet at one point, and the jets of all his corporate friends who are now going to be flying in and out of Toronto Harbour. That's a huge land development, redevelopment proposal. And the Highway 413 is really the mother of them all in terms of massive mega land development proposals for the future of Ontario. It's going to turn
Give me your read on the accountability officers here, because no matter how hard they try, I mean, whether it's the Auditor General, the Privacy Commissioner, the Information Commissioner, the Integrity Commissioner, they have stood up and said, you need to do this. And the government, in many cases, particularly with the 413, just ignores it.
The ultimate accountability is with voters. And at a certain point, I think the political resistance could overtake the government. Obviously they're in their third majority government now, right? They're getting to be a fairly long in the tooth kind of government, and maybe the voters will stay. I think we need a clean house here. Whether or not a new government, if it were a Liberal government or who knows what kind of government, might operate in exactly the same way. There's always a push and pull in Ontario between mega project development, spearheaded by the government in secret often, and calls for public accountability. We remember the enormous fights over Darlington Nuclear, over Bruce Nuclear, the secrecy around those projects when they were run by Ontario Hydro, when it was then an Ontario Crown Corporation. So there's a long history here. The public, I think, does have an interest in maintaining green spaces. These lands north of Toronto, north of the GTA, that are imperiled by the proposed highway are, according to environmentalists, the lungs of the city, of the GTA. This is the last remaining major expanse of open countryside that's unprotected. It's, I think, as I recall, about 100,000 hectares of potential development land. That's enormous. To get it launched, the government wants to buy 2,100 hectares of land to build a superhighway. One of the reasons, of course, they have to build that superhighway, they say, is that they sold off, the Tories themselves sold off and privatized the 407, which has never really served as a public highway. It's served as a private highway, and it's expensive, as we know. So now they're proposing to build a new highway that will be a springboard to mega development. Whether or not the public can get their head around that, I think they can. I don't think it's really so opaque. I think it's pretty clear-cut, straightforward stuff.
Do you have a sense of timing for a return decision from the court?
No, none whatsoever. It could be tomorrow. It could be in 6 months. To me, it looked like the judges were very busy. A lot of respect for what they do. It's hard work. I thought they did a phenomenal job of getting their heads around the files. The government's arguments that ran for 2 hours seemed to be aimed at making a fairly simple situation as complicated as possible. And the response from the Information Commission of Ontario was, this is not that complicated. This is pretty simple stuff. The government's doing a great job of delaying, obfuscating, making a lot of, smoke and mirrors and white noise in its efforts to keep these land records secret. But folks, they are not protected by cabinet confidentiality. The public has a right to know, what does the government actually plan to do with regards to expropriating and paying for likely billions of dollars worth of lands that are being bought up by developers on speculative basis. That's all it comes down to. It's not complicated.
Indeed. Well, fighting the good fight. Paul, thanks for sharing the story. And if you don't mind, once this pops up again, we might bug you for an update.
I would be keen. Thanks, Dave, for paying attention to this.
Very good. Paul Webster is the freelance journalist. You read him in the Star, the Trillium, and he's on the front lines of the 413 accountability. How much does it cost and who's involved? We'll find out.